For y'all that are just coming in, I would really invite you to come a bit closer. It would be fantastic. There's empty seats and rows. Nobody's going to bite. All right, thank you all for being here today. I am looking forward to having a discussion based on your thoughts and mine. I want to start by acknowledging that we are on unceded Musqueam territory. And I say this with all the seriousness that it deserves, in the hopes that the fact of this relationship, will enter into our hearts and mind. This is a place of mind, but I think our hearts are very much involved. I hope it will enter into our hearts and minds in ways that will encourage us to become accountable for the ways in which we benefit from this inequality in this place. I also want to make a confession before I start. When I was talking with Kylie about doing a seminar, I had fantasies of a nice, cozy room where we would be sitting together and talking about things. And that's really where my strength is sitting in those cozy spaces. This is not where I feel as if my strengths lie, but here we are. So let's make the best of it, which is why I was wanting you to be closer to me and to each other. This is a seminar, right? So let's make it one. All right. So today I want to talk about something that's really basic. The question of what we're doing here. We in this space called the university, we in this space whose primary purpose for being here revolves around doing research. So what is it that motivates our research questions? How do we decide where to do research and with who? And who are the people that we're working with, that we want to work with? And are people our only concern? Or are there other beings with whom we will enter into relation? What are the conditions that structure those relations with humans and non-humans, who are often framed as the objects of our research? Have we been invited into that relation? What do we know about communities, their practices, ontologies, epistemologies? And how do we come to know those things? And whose interests are being served? So these aren't rhetorical questions. And I hope that we'll have a discussion about them. And for now, I just invite you to take out a piece of paper or whatever you've got and just take a minute to jot down your thoughts. Where have your research questions come from? Where do they come from? And how do you come to the decision to work in a particular place? Or how are you in the process of doing that? So just take a second. No one's coerced. You don't have to do it, but just take a second to think about those things. So these are the questions that have plagued me for decades, I feel. And I can't say that I've reached any profound conclusions, nor have I resolved any of the dilemmas that these questions pose. But today I just want to share a few responses, things that I've been thinking about, and ways that I've tried to become more accountable to these questions and the dilemmas that they pose. And I want to come back to your thoughts after I share mine. And I have just basic PowerPoint because I know that not everyone has English as a first language. Many of us speak multiple languages, so words are always good and helpful in that regard. So in conventional research, kind of the conventional framing of research, there is a kind of a spatial imaginary that goes with that. And in that spatial imaginary, we have the observed, right? The observer, the researcher, and the observed, right? Those that we would like to observe. We have here and there, right? Home and field. We're here, they apparently are over there. Maybe this is our home in some kind of a way, right? And we frame other people as situated in our field sites. And I've been really interested in the kinds of constructions of selfhood, that are invited by these spatial imaginaries. So if we think about the observer and the observed, conventionally the observer is kind of situated in a hierarchical relationship to the observed, right? We're sitting up here or standing or whatever, and we're looking down on these others. And our goal is to attain some perspective, right, on relationships that we're looking at. And this kind of distance between us and them is somehow assumed to guarantee neutrality, right, objectivity, an unbiased view. We think of home or here and there as discretely bounded places. And we often think of people in the field as somehow different and distant. Again, this is in a kind of a conventional framing. So for me, personally, problems with this framing emerged during my dissertation research. And I thought of myself as a feminist political ecologist way back in the 90s, right? I think it was the 90s. And I was ardently committed to social and ecological justice. And I did research in Guatemala because I identified with the concerns of marginalized people whose livelihoods were threatened by the creation of a new biosphere reserve, which is pictured up there. As you can see, it's quite a large area of Guatemala. And so I was interested in the ways in which the biosphere reserve and the management practices that it enacted were intended to create this kind of idealized notion of nature, right, as somehow separate from culture, and that had real implications for people who already were living in this space. But while I was doing my fieldwork in Guatemala, I was much more likely to be identified with the powerful actors who were responsible for funding and implementing this biosphere reserve, embodied in educated, white, 20-somethings from the United States who really were not any different from me in pretty fundamental ways, right? So this close proximity to marginalized actors that I thought that I somehow identified with or wanted to support, as well as the elite actors with whom I was identified, right, brought the question of complicity to the forefront of my lived experience, right? What was I doing in Guatemala after all? What was I doing there, right? Undoubtedly, like, I was going to benefit a lot more from this biosphere reserve than anybody in northern Guatemala. I was the beneficiary of a Fulbright fellowship, right, which is funded by the U.S. government. The U.S. government was funding the biosphere reserve. And I would produce a dissertation, right, that was going to give me access to a whole world that would further career goals. Also, as I kind of moved between home and field, as we often do throughout the process of a long project, right, like a dissertation, I realized that I wasn't really interested in Guatemala per se, meaning Guatemala as a site of difference and distance from my home, the United States, Texas, whatever. I realized I wanted to understand how this biosphere reserve was constituted in and through asymmetrical relations between the United States and Guatemala. I wanted to know how home and field, here and there, and us and them were all bound up together and constituted through imperial capitalist relationships. And these questions, these dilemmas, these thoughts put me into conflict with my desire to have an objective observer status, right? To be doing that work of the objective observer that somehow is a fly on the wall. So how could I be an outsider looking on or looking in when I was entangled in and complicit with those very imperial capitalist relations? So years of reflection on these kinds of dilemmas that I thought so much about back in the day have pushed me to realize, along with many others that I'm sure you have read, that there is no objective, distant, or disinterested place from which to engage in research. So as scholars in the global north, we are already and always marinated in and complicit with geopolitical relations, right? And institutional knowledges that bear the traces of imperial histories. So as I see it now, the challenge is how to start from a place of entanglement, right? How to replace epistemologies that enact distance and hierarchy with those that assume interdependency and entanglement under asymmetrical conditions. What kind of changes do we need to enact on ethical and methodological levels to produce knowledge that is honest about these entanglements and honest about the ways in which we are intertwined and complicit with these systems? So I'm just going to go through a couple thoughts. One of them is sort of thinking about shifts from research ethics to an ethics of entanglement. So in sort of conventional research processes, we kind of decide where we want to do research, what kinds of questions we want to ask, and who we're going to do this research with. And then we have to address the question of how we're going to relate to the subjects of research, the objects of research or the research subjects. And I think the primary guidance that we're offered to try to think about this comes from what we call research ethics, right? But today, many of us encounter research ethics primarily through ethical review boards, right? This is one of the places as students and as researchers where we have to really come to face these questions, because we have to write them in these applications, right? How am I going to relate to this research subject, right? So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I feel like research ethics applications, I mean, there's tons of problems, we can discuss them, but one of the things that I've been thinking about is that they really focus on our behavior towards the observed during fieldwork, right? When the distance between the observer and the observed is breached, right? And the researcher is in direct contact with the objects of research. So the primary goal of ethics then is to minimize harm, right, to the observed. I think that's one of the primary ways, in addition to the fact that the university is trying to, deal with its liability issues, right? But what I think is interesting in this framing is that unquestioned is the right of the researcher to pursue knowledge about whatever, whenever, wherever, and with whomever we choose, right? That doesn't enter into those research ethics applications. Now, to be sure, feminists and anti-racist scholars have developed a lot of alternative framings of research ethics and research methodologies. So, for instance, collaborative forms of research, right, to shift power relations between researchers and research participants. There's a lot of amazing work, right, that has helped us really think through these questions and think about how we might shift our relationships. But I think it would be naive to suggest that any of these forms of research lie beyond the legacies of imperialism and therefore are somehow free of ethical dilemmas. Fundamentally, our positions of privilege place us in asymmetrical positions and relations with the majority of people on Earth today. I don't think there's any way to not deny that. More to the point, we are inextricably situated in, complicit with, and benefit from the very political and economic systems that constitute our research subjects. So rather than observers who can extricate ourselves from imperial capitalist relations to look down on the practices of others, we are entangled, right? We're fundamentally entangled in those relationships. And there's no way to conduct research that will absolve us of, in my opinion, imperial complicity or ethical dilemmas. Now, does this mean we should not do research? This is a question I've thought about. Other people too. Arguably, there are actually moments when our ideas for research projects should be abandoned. Like when our research objectives do not align with the interests or the capacity or the political goals of the communities that we would like to work with. Just something we have to address, right? And yet, I take direction from a geographer. Her name is Richa Nagar. And she argues that the dilemmas of research do not justify our decision to remain silent, right, about the struggles facing marginalized peoples. She suggests that we, scholars, and here I quote her, should accept the challenge of figuring out how to productively engage with and participate in mutually beneficial knowledge production about those struggles that people are facing. And I take up Nagar's challenge by suggesting that we shift our concept of ethics from being solely about our proximate relations with research subjects to being about how to be ethical in entanglement. And I think that to do this requires a transformation of those very relations at ontological, epistemological, and practical levels. So I'm just going to talk about that. Whoops. Yes, right. So to foster this transformation of ethics, I call for more attention to homework. And this is the work that we undertake before fieldwork or in the process of fieldwork. And I borrowed this idea of homework from Gayatri Spivak, who uses the term to describe efforts to identify the coordinates of one's own location in a geopolitical world shaped by coloniality. So for Spivak, homework entails a self-reflexive analysis of one's own epistemological and ontological assumptions about self and other, here and there, humans, non-humans, right, etc. And really thinking profoundly about how these ontologies have been naturalized in academic practices and how that process of naturalization takes place in relation to geopolitical and institutional power relationships. Let's see, where am I here? For Spivak, homework is a key practice in unlearning what we have learned, unlearning privilege, and especially the privilege of sanctioned ignorance. For example, here in BC, sanctioned ignorance that allows for the perpetuation of silence about ongoing colonial violence, just as an example. So homework starts from where we are, but the goal is to move beyond kind of identity politics in the sense of like, okay, so I'm a white, middle-class woman from the United States, and I'm going to acknowledge this in my work, but I'm still going to do the research exactly the way that I want to, right? Where I want to, when I want to, and ask the questions that I want to ask, right? The purpose of doing homework is to take responsibility for the epistemological and ontological worlds that we enact through the everyday practices that are entailed in academic research. So, what do I mean by homework? Let's get more into this. And I will talk about 3 homework tasks on 3 levels that I've kind of separated, even though they can't really be separated. And that is kind of ontology, epistemology, and practical levels. But keeping in mind, right, that they're always intersecting. So, ontological tasks, homework tasks, right? I think a principal task of homework is to inquire about the ontological categories that we mobilize in the very design of our research questions. If we accept that the contemporary university system is the outcome of European colonialism, or was formed in relation to, in the process of European colonialism, one consequence of that is that universities offer what James Blount calls the colonizer's model of the world. So what does this Eurocentric model of the world imply for the basic categories that we use in the social sciences and sciences today? The very basic categories: human, animal, nature, history, progress, labor, property, capitalism, governance, right? We could go on with these lists. And these categories, we have to acknowledge, are fundamentally embody the legacies of colonialism. They come out of, they were constituted in relation to colonial practices. And what does it mean then when these categories are deployed in scholarship as if they are universally applicable, right? Valid tools with which we can analyze anywhere in the world, anybody, right, at any moment. And what kinds of ontological violence, then, is authorized when these kinds of categories become the primary reference of our analysis? This, I think, is a fundamental question. This is part of the everyday practices, right? And the kind of self-fashioning practices that take place in research. Yeah. Yes, we can think, well, there's all kinds of things that we can think of, but I mean, one that comes to mind that we're working on in my research seminar is the category of the human. We think we know what that means. We think we know what it means to be human, and we think we have the tools to do an analysis based on our understanding of what it means to be human. And yet, we should know very well, even just living here, that there are multiple ways of being human in the world. And when we mobilize one vision of what it means to be human, right, we're actually erasing other ways of being human, which to me is a colonial gesture, a gesture of erasure. It's not a very specific example, but I don't know, does that help? Yeah. Okay, good, yeah. Questions are welcome. I know it's very abstract, but just kind of hoping, yeah, we would have a conversation. So what I'm trying to think about here in asking this question about these categories is what kind of homework do we need to do to have the capacity to think about ontological multiplicity, right? Instead of sort of thinking about one set of categories that we already know, that we already mobilize, and that we then operationalize, right, as if they are universally applicable. So for that, we need to think about epistemological tasks, right? The question of how knowledge is produced and legitimated, right? Through what kinds of practices? Who counts as a legitimate knowledge producer, right? And how and why? Do animals count as knowledge producers? I mean, For centuries, women didn't count as knowledge producers, right? How do we position ourselves in relation to these objects of research? And even that term, right? I'm using it because it's harsh, it's hard, right? But that's one of the ways in which we relate to research subjects, or can. You don't have to. For Sami scholar Rauna Kuokkanen, who actually did her PhD here at UBC, she says the will to know is tied to colonial logics of domination, in that it entails privileging our own ontologies and epistemologies, again, as if they are universal. And in her work, she emphasizes, let's see, where am I here? She emphasizes the difference between learning to know the other and learning as engagement with the other, which entails learning from the other, right? So she tries to think about these different ways of learning and knowing and what it means to learn, and trying to, again, think about this when we want to understand, right, a people and a place, thinking about this will to know, right? What does it mean? In her own work, she calls for learning as participatory reciprocity, right, which frames knowledge as a social activity that is actually moving in all kinds of directions, right, and potentially involves all kinds of beings. All right, so we have a couple of practical tasks in addition to ontological and epistemological tasks. And for me, these are questions about our research interests, the kinds of questions I started out with today, right? Our affective attachments or investments in our research questions. Why do we want to do a particular kind of research anyway? Like, what is our purpose? Why in geography and anthropology is fieldwork in a faraway place still a rite of passage? Why and how are these places made to appear available for research, right? The world is before us. We can go anywhere and everywhere. Certainly me with a US passport, it's one of my privileges, right? Gupta and Ferguson, in a piece a long time ago, ask us, to what extent do we map difference onto exotic sites, thereby presuming, and I'm quoting here, otherness means difference from an unmarked white Western self. What makes us personally attached to the idea of going to places that we frame as different and distant? Is our decision-making driven by theoretical questions, personal investments, career opportunities? Whose interests are we serving? For Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, these questions are crucial because white Western researchers, she says, often position themselves and their research as, quote, serving a greater good for mankind. In her work, she points to counter stories about, and I quote here, the absolute worthlessness of research to us, the indigenous world, this is her quote, and its absolute usefulness to those who wielded it as an instrument. So as we learn to listen to and reckon with these counter stories, I would suggest that one challenge is to avoid over-personalizing individual complicity in oppressive relations of power, even as I've been speaking about it. And here I've taken heart from the work of Ann Bishop, who's a community and anti-racist educator. And she suggests distinguishing between guilt and responsibility. And she says that requires balancing, and here I quote, an understanding of oneself as an individual and as part of a collective reality. She says guilt, oops, I think I sort of forgot to continue. Guilt means taking on all the weight of history as an individual. This is her quote. Responsibility means accepting your share of the challenge of changing the situation. So, let me just summarize here and wrap up. In talking about homework and these sort of homework tasks, I'm sure there are many more. Those are the ones that I came up with. I don't mean to suggest that homework should take the place of ethical responsibilities to those that are enrolled in our research in terms of that notion of proximity, right? But rather, I mean to question and transform how we understand those very responsibilities. So for me, homework implies learning about, so as to seriously consider and begin to unlearn imperial habits that produce the world as a collection of places available for our geographical expeditions and extractive forms of research. The aim of these tasks is not to achieve some kind of position of purity from which to undertake research, as if that were even possible. But the purpose of homework is to situate ourselves so as to enable ethical decisions about what to research, right? With whom, using what practices, and to what ends. So homework cultivates accountability for the epistemological and ontological worlds that we enact through academic practices. What kind of world do we want to be involved in enacting? Let's see. All right. When I think about these questions, questions of research, questions of sort of what am I doing, I often turn to the Zapatistas, the writing by the Zapatistas. And in this instance, I turned to the Zapatistas' sixth declaration from the Selva Lacandona in 2005 to try to think about how to think about this ethic of entanglement. And the sixth declaration was useful to me because it invites people engaged in struggles against neoliberalism and for democracy and justice to walk with the Zapatistas. And their vision of walking with, I think, breaks with liberal notions of solidarity and political alliances. So walking with does not mean helping the Zapatistas, right? Nor does it mean becoming like the Zapatistas, becoming a Zapatista, right? Living in Chiapas. As the sixth declaration outlines, to walk with the Zapatistas means to be involved in the struggle for a just world from and in our own sites of entanglement and engagement. So the question that I have been thinking about is, what would it be like? What would it look like? What would it feel like to frame research in terms of walking with differently situated others in intersecting yet distinct and unequally constituted struggles? That's the question that I've been thinking about. So what I would love to do is if you can look at your notes, right? And if we can have a conversation, reactions, questions, the things that you jotted down about where your research questions come from, the kinds of things that you've struggled with, I would really like that. I realize that this space is not conducive to having a conversation. But think of it this way, no one behind you can see you, so you can say what you want to say, right? No one's going to look at you, which is different when you're sitting around a table and you look everybody straight in the eye, right? Any thoughts, reactions, disruptions? Yeah.